A founder who avoided the spotlight for 18 years suddenly chooses a government stage in China. That's not PR, it's risk management. And it tells you Shein's biggest threat isn't competition, it's approval. On the morning of February 24, 2026, a man in a black suit and a maroon tie stepped onto a stage in Guangdong province and spoke in public for the first time in his life. His name was Xu Yangtian. He had founded Shein 18 years earlier, building it from a small cross-border e-commerce operation in Nanjing into one of the most recognizable retail brands on the planet. In the years since, his company had sold $5 bike shorts and $18 sundresses to consumers in more than 160 countries. Its algorithm-driven design cycle could take a product from concept to delivery in under 3 weeks. Its app had been downloaded more times than any other shopping application in the United States. And yet, through all of it, Xu had never given a speech. He had never held a press conference. He had never appeared at a product launch or a funding announcement. The company's valuation had been discussed in boardrooms across Wall Street, the City of London, and Hong Kong's financial district, and its founder had, until that Tuesday morning in Guangdong, been entirely absent from every one of those conversations. The occasion was a government conference on high-quality economic development. Xu praised Guangdong's industrial ecosystem. He announced plans to invest more than 10 billion yuan, approximately $1.4 billion, in a smart supply chain system in the province. He described the region's comprehensive manufacturing network as foundational to Shein's global success. The speech lasted a few minutes. Its significance lay not in what was said but in what it signaled. The man who had spent nearly 2 decades operating from the margins of public life had chosen this moment, this audience, and this message. Guangdong, Chinese roots, supply chain investment, Beijing. The timing was not accidental. Shein's path to a public listing had been in motion, in one form or another, since at least 2023. The company had confidentially filed for an initial public offering with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission in November of that year, engaging advisors and beginning the preliminary work of a major listing. The valuation being discussed in those early conversations was reported at various points between $66 and $100 billion, depending on the source and the moment. Shein was, by any measure, one of the largest private companies in the world. Its revenue was substantial. Its growth had been among the fastest recorded by any retail business in history. The SEC filing, however, ran almost immediately into a wall that the company's advisors had understood was possible but may have underestimated in its rigidity. United States lawmakers from both parties had been scrutinizing Shein for years on 2 specific grounds. The first was its use of the de minimis trade provision, which allowed individual packages valued at $800 or less to enter the United States without customs duties or detailed inspection. The second was its supply chain's alleged connection to cotton sourced from Xinjiang, a region subject to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, signed into law in December 2021, which created a rebuttable presumption that any goods produced in whole or in part in Xinjiang were made with forced labor and were therefore barred from importation into the United States. Shein had conducted audits. It had published supplier transparency reports. It had maintained consistently that its supply chain was clean. The audits, however, were conducted by third parties operating within a Chinese regulatory environment that imposed strict limits on what information could be shared with foreign governments or foreign-commissioned investigators. Chinese data security and state secrets laws created a structural constraint. Full disclosure to Western regulators was not legally possible without exposure to liability under Chinese law. The company was positioned between 2 legal systems with incompatible requirements and no available path that satisfied both simultaneously. Congressional pressure on the SEC intensified through early 2024. Letters were sent, hearings were held. The political risk of approving a major listing for a company facing these allegations, in the climate of 2024, was significant enough that the SEC process slowed without a formal rejection. By May 2024, it was clear that the New York listing was not moving forward on any near-term timeline. Shein shifted its attention to London. The London Stock Exchange offered a different regulatory environment. The Financial Conduct Authority's listing requirements were rigorous but distinct from the SEC's framework. and the political pressure from UK lawmakers, while real, was less immediately paralyzing than what the company had encountered in Washington. Shein engaged London-based advisors, approached fund managers in the city, and began working toward a filing with the LSE. By March 2025, the FCA had granted approval for the listing. The path to a London IPO appeared for the first time to be technically open. What the FCA could not provide was approval from Beijing. Chinese regulations, implemented in the years since the Didi Global debacle of 2021, in which the ride-sharing company's U.S. listing triggered a severe response from Chinese authorities and effectively destroyed shareholder value, required companies with significant data operations in China to obtain clearance from the China Securities Regulatory Commission before proceeding with an overseas listing. Shein, despite having reincorporated in Singapore in 2021, operated a supply chain and logistics infrastructure that was deeply embedded in China. Its data flows, its supplier network, its manufacturing relationships, all of it ran through Chinese systems subject to Chinese oversight. The CSRC clearance that Shein had expected to follow the FCA approval did not arrive. Weeks passed. The silence from Beijing was not a rejection, formally. It was something more complicated. An unresolved condition that left the company in a state of suspension between two regulatory systems, neither of which had said no, and neither of which had said yes. By May 2025, sources close to the matter told Reuters that the London listing had stalled, and that Shein was pivoting toward a Hong Kong listing instead, aiming to file a draft prospectus with the Hong Kong Stock Exchange within weeks. The Singapore reincorporation, which had been executed in 2021 partly as a strategy to create distance from direct Chinese regulatory oversight, had not produced the result that distance implied. Shein was not treated by Chinese regulators as a Singaporean company for the purposes of overseas listing approval. It was treated as a company with Chinese origins, Chinese supply chains, and Chinese data. And those origins carried obligations that a change of legal address in a different jurisdiction could not dissolve. The rebranding as a Singapore entity had been, in regulatory terms, largely cosmetic. This was the structural trap that no amount of legal maneuvering had resolved. Shein needed Chinese regulatory approval to list overseas, and Chinese regulators had reason to be cautious. A major Shein IPO in London or Hong Kong would require the company to disclose financial and operational information in a format accessible to Western regulators and investors. That information included details about supply chain geography, data practices, and business relationships that intersected directly with areas of Chinese state sensitivity. The Cyberspace Administration of China had, since 2021, treated the cross-border flow of certain categories of operational data as a matter of national security. A company processing the purchasing behavior and personal data of hundreds of millions of consumers globally occupied an uncomfortable position in that framework. Simultaneously, the trade environment that had made Shein's business model possible was being dismantled. The de minimis provision, the $800 threshold below which individual packages entered the United States duty-free, had been a structural advantage for Shein since it began shipping direct-to-consumer from Chinese warehouses. Traditional retailers importing goods through commercial channels paid standard tariffs on every shipment. Shein's model, which sent individual parcels directly to individual consumers, had allowed it to bypass that cost layer entirely. A House Select Committee report in 2023 found that Shein and Temu together accounted for approximately 30% of all de minimis shipments into the United States, roughly 400 million packages annually, arriving free of the duties that their brick-and-mortar and traditional e-commerce competitors paid on every unit. President Trump signed an executive order ending de minimis treatment for imports from China and Hong Kong in early 2025. The change took effect in May of that year. The pricing arithmetic that had allowed Shein to sell a dress for $12 and a pair of shorts for $5 and still generate a margin was built on that duty-free entry. Standard commercial tariffs, applied at rates that had been escalating through the U.S.-China trade conflict, changed the cost structure of every single shipment. Shein announced price increases in April 2025, ahead of the change's effective date. The increases were visible and immediate, and they were communicated to consumers who had built shopping habits around a price point that no longer reflected the actual cost of the supply chain. This was, in the terms used when examining the decision that cost billions for companies that built their competitive position on regulatory conditions they did not control, the foundational vulnerability made visible. The de minimis provision had not been designed for Shein. It had been designed in 1938 to simplify customs processing for low-value tourist purchases. The decision to build a global retail operation on a provision that was structurally temporary, subject to executive action, legislative change, or simple administrative reinterpretation at any point, was not an oversight. The risk had been discussed publicly for years. But the competitive advantage it provided was large enough, and the window during which it remained available was long enough that the business model calculus held. Until it didn't. The forced labor question operated on a different timeline but arrived at the same structural problem. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act created a legal presumption, not a finding. It did not require proof that a specific shipment contained goods made with forced labor. It presumed that goods with Xinjiang inputs were barred and placed the burden of rebuttal on the importer. For a company sourcing from thousands of small suppliers across a Guangdong manufacturing ecosystem, suppliers who themselves sourced materials through multi-tier supply chains that the company did not fully control, the compliance burden was, in practice, nearly impossible to meet at scale. Shein's audits addressed the suppliers it could see. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the scrutiny it triggered were concerned with the suppliers of suppliers and the raw material sourcing several steps upstream. Cotton from Xinjiang, which before the legislation had supplied a significant share of China's textile industry, did not arrive at a Shein supplier's factory labeled with its origin. It arrived as yarn, as fabric, processed through multiple stages in which its geographic source had been commingled, transformed, or simply undocumented. The audit frameworks available in 2024 and 2025 were not equipped to trace that chain with the certainty that Western regulators and institutional investors required. The institutional investor question was ultimately where the geopolitical standoff made itself most visible in financial terms. A pension fund or a sovereign wealth fund preparing to anchor a Shein IPO in London or Hong Kong had to evaluate not just the company's revenue and growth rate, but its regulatory risk profile across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The forced labor exposure created legal liability in the United States and increasing scrutiny in the European Union, which was advancing its own supply chain due diligence framework. The de minimis laws had structurally altered the unit economics of the U.S. business, which was Shein's largest market by consumer penetration. The unresolved CSRC approval created a condition that could not be priced. It was not a known risk with a known range of outcomes, but an open dependency on a decision that a foreign government had not made and had not indicated when it would make. Valuation ranges in that environment became a negotiation between what the company's operational performance implied and what the sum of its regulatory overhangs subtracted. The peak estimates of $100 billion discussed in 2022 and early 2023 had reflected a growth stage premium applied to a company with extraordinary revenue expansion and a logistics model that seemed, at the time, defensible. By February 2026, the valuation figure cited publicly was approximately $53 billion. The number Xu Yangtian referenced in his Guangdong speech, derived from Chinese yuan figures released in conjunction with his appearance. The distance between the peak estimate and the current figure was not a market correction. It was a regulatory discount, applied incrementally by investors who were watching each successive obstacle accumulate without resolution. The three failed listing venues told their own version of the sequence. New York had been the first choice, the deepest capital market, the highest visibility, the most prestigious exchange for a global consumer brand. The SEC process had not produced a formal rejection. It had produced a silence heavy enough to force a pivot. London had been the second choice, a market eager for major listings after years of losing large companies to U.S. exchanges. A regulatory environment the FCA had been willing to open. The FCA had approved. Beijing had not. Hong Kong had become the third option, announced in the spring of 2025, representing a strategic retreat toward the regulatory framework that had always been the underlying constraint. A Hong Kong listing would occur within reach of Chinese oversight, in a market whose institutional investor base understood the geopolitical context differently than London or New York did. and at a valuation that reflected the accumulated discounts of 3 years of regulatory friction. As of February 2026, the Hong Kong filing had not been publicly confirmed. The company's founder had, for the first time, appeared in public, in Guangdong, in front of a provincial government audience, pledging investment in Chinese manufacturing infrastructure. The message was addressed less to international investors than to the one audience whose approval remained the unresolved variable in every IPO scenario: Beijing. Whether the Hong Kong path would clear the CSRC obstacle that had blocked London was, at the time of Shu's appearance, an open question. A Hong Kong listing would still require regulatory cooperation between the HKEX and Chinese authorities, still require financial disclosures that touch the same sensitive data and supply chain questions, and still require institutional investors to commit capital to a company whose U.S. business had been structurally altered by the de minimis closure, and whose forced labor compliance exposure had not been conclusively resolved. The Guangdong speech represented something visible in the record: a company recalibrating toward its points of origin after years of attempting to reframe itself as a Singaporean entity operating at arm's length from Chinese state structures. The reincorporation in Singapore had been, from the beginning, a strategic communication exercise as much as a legal one, an attempt to present Shein to Western regulators and Western investors as something other than a Chinese company subject to Chinese regulatory authority. The exercise had not produced the result it was designed to achieve. Western regulators had looked at the supply chain, the data practices, the operational geography, and had not found the Singapore address persuasive. Chinese regulators had looked at the same company and had declined to treat the Singapore address as grounds for reduced oversight of an overseas listing. In the space between those two positions, the IPO had remained suspended. The business, in the meantime, kept running. Shein's export value in 2025 exceeded 100 billion yuan, approximately $14.5 billion, according to figures cited by Shu at the Guangdong conference. The platform served over 160 countries. Its logistics and design infrastructure remained among the most efficient in the global fast fashion industry. The small batch fast response model that had defined its competitive advantage, the ability to identify a trending design and deliver a manufactured product to a consumer's door in 2 to 3 weeks, had not been dismantled by the regulatory environment. It had been made more expensive in the United States, less accessible to certain institutional investors, and considerably more complicated to bring to a public exchange. But it had not stopped. What the regulatory standoff had prevented was not the operation of the business. It had prevented the conversion of the business into public equity at the terms the company's early investors and founders had been anticipating for years. The investors who had participated in private rounds at peak valuations were holding positions in a company that had not provided a public exit and had seen its private valuation estimates compress materially. The employees and executives who had received equity compensation were in a comparable position, liquid only through whatever secondary market mechanisms existed for a private company of Shein's size and complexity. The parallel to earlier cases in this space is available in the record. Companies that built competitive positions on regulatory conditions they did not control, on trade provisions, on political arrangements, on the continued absence of enforcement that had been technically possible for years, have encountered the same structural moment when the conditions changed. The decision that costs billions is not always a single executive choice in a conference room. Sometimes it is the accumulated weight of a business model that required a particular regulatory environment to remain intact, and the failure to resolve the vulnerability before the environment shifted. Xu Yangtian's Guangdong speech on February 24, 2026, was 18 years into the company's history. It was the first time he had spoken publicly. The investors watching the Hong Kong filing timeline, the CSRC approval process, and the U.S. tariff litigation did not need a speech to tell them where the company stood. The filings, when they arrive, will say the rest.